The kitchen hummed with the low whir of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of the wall clock marking each second like a countdown. Julia sat at the end of the wooden dining table, the divorce papers untouched beside her coffee mug. The ink had long dried. The betrayal, however, was still raw. Across from her, Darren leaned against the counter, arms crossed, face unreadable, except for his eyes. They avoided hers. It had been 3 weeks since everything came undone, and neither of them had figured out how to talk again without tearing each other apart. "I'm going to see Marcus today," Darren finally said, his voice too calm. Julia's jaw clenched. "You mean your therapist?" He hesitated. "No, Marcus Grant. The contractor," she scoffed. "Right, the one who helped renovate your lies." His mouth opened to respond, but then shut. He had no defense. The affair wasn't physical, at least not at first. It started with texts, then drinks after late meetings, then a hotel room. Julia found the receipts hidden in a folder on the desktop he never thought she'd open. What hurt more was the length of it. 2 years. 2 entire years of her husband living a second life with another woman. Her name was Camille. 34, single mother, personal assistant to Darren's CEO. Julia had seen a photo. She had the kind of face that made Julia feel like she'd spent the last decade becoming invisible. Chapter 2. The other side of the story. Darren didn't plan to cheat. At first, Camille was just someone who laughed at his jokes when Julia barely looked up from her phone. She listened, asked about his day. She didn't roll her eyes when he complained about the pressures of work or the emptiness at home. With Julia, it had been routine. Comfortable, yes, but silent. Tired, but none of that excused what he did. "I wasn't looking for anything," he had told Julia when she confronted him. "It just happened." That's what people say when they want to sound like it wasn't their fault. She was right. He made a choice, and now the silence between them had become a wall. Chapter 3. Investigations. Julia had been the one to start digging, unable to let it go. She copied Camille's name from Darren's phone while he slept and hired a private investigator. Not because she needed proof, she had that, but because she wanted to understand. What came back was more than she expected. Camille had been involved in a fraud case 3 years ago, never charged but closely tied to a financial consultant who had embezzled funds from her previous employer. That man was Marcus Grant, the same contractor Darren had just mentioned. Darren had never brought up Marcus before the affair. Now Julia began to wonder, was it just infidelity or something deeper, something criminal? Chapter 4. Lies Between the Lines. "You think I knew?" Darren shouted when she confronted him, with the files. "You think I was part of some scam? You were already lying to me about her. Why would this be different?" The confrontation was volcanic. Darren denied knowing anything about Camille's past, and maybe he was telling the truth, but Julia couldn't tell anymore. She didn't trust herself to know. Her best friend, Lydia, warned her. "Betrayal distorts everything. You start doubting your own instincts, even your memories." "But what if there is more?" Julia asked. "Then ask yourself, what are you trying to prove? That you were right to hate him, or that you don't want to feel stupid for loving him?" Chapter 5. A crack in the wall. Darren moved into the guest bedroom. For the first time in years, he cooked dinner. Just for himself. But the smell filled the house. One night, Julia sat at the table while he ate. He didn't speak. She didn't either. But that night, she didn't cry when she went to bed. Later, that week, Darren handed her a printed email from his boss. Camille had been fired months ago, quietly. No charges, but suspicions confirmed. Darren hadn't known, at least not officially, but his silence had protected her for a while. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I should have told you. About her, About everything. Julia folded the paper, stared at her husband. So why tell me now? Because I want you to know that I'm not protecting her anymore. Chapter 6. Moral Ambiguities. The investigator kept digging. Julia never called him off. Not yet. What he uncovered next was more than scandal. It was personal. Camille had used Darren's credentials to access client files, fraudulent invoices. Julia couldn't ignore it. She gave Darren the evidence. He didn't deny it. But he didn't look surprised either. "You knew," she said, voice cracking. "I suspected, but if I turned her in, I'd lose my job. We'd lose the house, everything." "And me?" He was silent. Chapter 7. Crossroads. Julia filed a police report. Camille was arrested a week later. Darren's company placed him on leave pending investigation. Lydia called Julia brave, but Julia didn't feel brave. She felt empty. In their house, boxes were half-packed. Julia sat in the living room staring at her wedding album. She hadn't filed the divorce papers yet. Something stopped her. Darren came home one evening and sat beside her. No words. Just the photo of their honeymoon in Santorini between them. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I'm just asking if we can figure out who we are without all the noise." She turned the page. Epilogue. The quiet. Between, Julia didn't move out. Darren didn't move back in. They lived in the same house, spoke softly, shared the garden. There were no declarations, no grand decisions, just quiet. Some nights, they sat by the fireplace without touching. Some nights they shared a bottle of wine. The investigator called once more. Camille had struck a deal implicating others. Darren's charges were dropped, but the damage was already done. Julia kept the divorce papers in her drawer, and every few days she'd take them out, stare at them, then quietly tuck them back in. Ending note: forgiveness wasn't a promise. Neither was revenge. Some wounds didn't bleed, they ached. And sometimes what remained after betrayal wasn't closure, but the quiet in between. The space where people decided if they were still worth saving. Spring came in slow waves. The garden, Darren's project after the fallout, had begun to bloom. Tulips sprouted in straight lines, daffodils in careless clusters. Julia watched him kneel in the dirt every morning, sleeves rolled, hands covered, in soil like he was trying to bury something deeper than roots. Sometimes she joined him, never for long. They spoke less now, but when they did, the words felt truer. No performance, just presence. "You always wanted a garden," he said one morning. "I wanted us to have something to grow." They didn't look at each other after that. But they didn't walk away either. Chapter 9. The return of Camille. It wasn't over. Camille was out on bail. She called once. Julia didn't answer, but Darren did. Julia found out later, by accident. A voicemail on the landline, half erased. Camille's voice was breathy, desperate. "They're going to take everything from me, Darren. You know the truth. You know I didn't mean to drag you into it. Just tell them." The message cut off. Julia confronted him again, this time not with fire, but exhaustion. "Why are you still answering her calls?" She was scared, he said, and I needed to hear her say it. I needed to know she regretted it. "Do you?" He paused. Yes, it wasn't enough. But it wasn't a lie. Chapter 10. Lydia's warning. Lydia had been her anchor through everything, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many friends fold under the pressure of forgiveness. "You're still in love with him," she said bluntly. Julia didn't deny it, but she didn't confirm it either. And love doesn't mean you owe him your life. Julia stared out at the garden. "It's not about owing, it's about..." Whether we still belong in the same story. Lydia's expression softened. Then make sure it's your story too, not just his recovery arc. Chapter 11. A letter. Never sent one night, Julia wrote a letter. Darren, I don't know if I want to stay married to you. I don't know if I can look at you and not see every lie behind your eyes. But I also don't know how to be without you. I miss us. The U.S. before the cracks, before Camille, before silence became survival. Maybe we're too broken, or maybe we're just raw. I need to learn how to trust you again, or let you go, and I don't know which is harder. She folded it and put it in the back of her journal. She never gave it to him. Chapter 12. A house with 2 doors by summer. They were still living under the same roof, not as husband and wife, but as 2 people, trying to decide if love was enough without trust. One night, Darren came in late. Julia was up. Walked the long way back, he said. You could have texted. He nodded. I didn't want you waiting. I wasn't. They stood like that for a moment, awkward, tired, but still connected. Then he said, Do you want me to go? Julia looked at him for a long time. I want you to want to stay, but not out of guilt. He nodded. He didn't move. Final chapter. The door left. Ajar on a cool evening in September, Julia woke before sunrise. The air was thick with quiet. She walked out to the garden and saw Darren sleeping on the patio chair, arms folded, head back, like he couldn't bear the idea of sleeping inside alone. She watched him for a while, then went back in and made coffee. For 2. Epilogue. The future. Unwritten. They never had the big conversation. No dramatic reconciliation, no screaming matches in the rain, just slow mornings, half conversations, 2 people trying. Julia kept the divorce papers, but she also set an extra mug every morning, and Darren kept planting things. Not everything bloomed, but some things did. Some endings don't come with closure. Some just stay open, like a door that could still swing either way, depending on who decides to walk through it. The garden looked different this year. Some of the plants had died. Others thrived despite Darren's neglect. The symmetry was gone, rows crooked, soil untended. But in some strange way, it felt more honest, less like a performance, more like a scar that healed without asking for permission. Julia stood on the back porch, arms wrapped around her sweater, watching the leaves twist to the ground like they too were letting go of something old. Darren hadn't lived in the house for 3 months. They weren't divorced. Not officially. But he had moved out with a suitcase and a half-hearted promise. This isn't me leaving you. It's me trying to find out who I am without this weight on us. He never said us. Just this. Chapter 2. The apartment, Darren's new apartment, was above a bookstore. Small, clean, filled with silence. The kind of silence that didn't accuse. He worked freelance IT now, drank less, talked more to his sister, even started therapy again. But there were nights when the silence shifted, when Camille's voice haunted the corners and Julia's absence felt heavier than her presence ever did. Sometimes he wrote emails to Julia that he never sent. One draft ended with, I miss your stubbornness more than your sweetness. I miss being someone you once trusted. I don't miss who I became in our marriage, but I miss who I was when you looked at me with faith. He deleted it. Chapter 3. An unexpected message. Julia's phone buzzed. From Lydia. You should know, Camille got indicted. Again, wire fraud, new charges. She might go to prison this time. Julia didn't respond right away. She poured herself a glass of wine and stared at the message for an hour. Then, without meaning to, she forwarded it to Darren. No text, no commentary. 10. Minutes later, her phone lit up. Darren. I heard. I'm sorry she's still orbiting our lives like this. Let me know if you want to talk. She didn't reply, but she saved the message. Chapter 4. The dinner Thanksgiving came with a sense of fragile truce. Lydia hosted. Against better judgment, she invited Darren. Just dinner, she told Julia. No subtext. You can always leave early. Julia almost didn't go. But she showed up, not for Darren, for herself. He was already there when she arrived, clean-shaven, nervous, his smile small, as if trying not to claim too much space. Over roast chicken and mashed potatoes, they spoke about neutral things, work, weather, a podcast they both still listened to in silence, a reminder that habits outlast heartbreak. Later, while Lydia cleared plates, Darren said, "You look like someone who sleeps again." She nodded. "And you look like someone who stopped apologizing for existing." They laughed. It was the kind of laughter people share when they're not sure if they're still in love or just remembering what it was like to be. Chapter 5. A Door. Slightly open in December, he called her. "I still think about us," he said. Julia closed her eyes. What part of us? The part that fought, the part that failed, and the part that still hasn't said goodbye. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Maybe we should talk. Really talk. No expectations. No titles." He agreed. They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from their old house. Not neutral territory. Familiar enough to feel real, distant enough to feel safe. They talked for 3 hours. About what they did wrong, what they never said, what they still didn't understand. At one point, Darren said, "If you asked me to come home tonight, I don't know if I'd say yes. But I wouldn't hang up either." Julia stared at him, unsure whether to cry or laugh. "I'm not asking," she whispered, "but I'm not done listening." Epilogue. Maybe. They didn't get back together, not right away, but they started talking, once a week. Sometimes they shared silence, sometimes memories, sometimes just a walk without naming what it meant. They were 2 people building something again, not a marriage, not yet, maybe never, but something rooted in honesty this time. No promises, just maybe. And for now, that was enough. Julia opened the front door without thinking. Darren stood there with a box of books and a nervous smile. "I left these," he said. "Thought maybe you'd want them back." She stepped aside. "Let him in." It was the first time he'd entered the house in over 9 months. The garden was still struggling. "I've been meaning to fix the irrigation," he said, eyes scanning the backyard like it was a barometer for the health of their relationship. "Don't," she replied. "Let it be messy. It's honest." They sat in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of old arguments and quiet Sundays. Then Julia broke it. "I don't want you to move back in." Darren nodded, caught between disappointment and relief. "But I want us to try something new," she added. "Something that doesn't pretend we're the same people we used to be." "A new version of us?" "A new language," she said. "No more performing forgiveness. No more asking for it when we don't mean it." "So what's the rule?" "Truth, always. Even when it's ugly." Chapter 2. Other people. There were others, eventually. Julia went on a few dates. A quiet architect. A single father with sad eyes. She never slept with any of them, but she let herself feel wanted again. She told Darren about them, not to hurt him, but to stay in the language of truth. He listened. He never judged, but once his voice broke just enough to betray the ache. "I'm glad you're letting people in," he said. "I never really let you in," she replied. And it was true. Darren, for his part, had a brief fling with a woman from group therapy, Lena. Strong, perceptive. She didn't know his history. Not right away. and that made it easier. But when she found out about Camille, about Julia, about the wreckage, she pulled back. "Are you still in love with your wife?" she asked. He didn't answer quickly enough, and that was its own answer. Chapter 3. Camille's Sentence. In early spring, the news broke. Camille had taken a plea deal, 5 years minimum, no parole. Julia read the article alone. A grainy photo of a woman who once upended her life. She didn't feel vindicated, or even satisfied. Just tired. That night she called Darren. "I thought I'd feel something more," she said. "I did too." There was a long pause. She finally asked what had been haunting her for months. "Did you love her?" "No," Darren said quietly. "But I needed her to believe I was still good. That was the worst part." "Why?" "Because I stopped trying to be good for you." Chapter 4. The letter one morning, Julia found an envelope slipped into the mailbox, no return address, just her name. Inside was a letter from Camille. "Julia, you don't owe me anything, least of all your attention. But I need to say this. He loved you. Even when he failed. Especially when he failed. I was a mirror. For his shame. You were his anchor. That doesn't make what happened right. But I wanted you to know. He was never pretending with you. He just forgot how to be seen." Julia burned the letter, but not before reading it 3 times. Chapter 5. What remains by autumn, the garden had grown wild. No symmetry, no borders, but beauty, in unexpected places. Darren visited often now. They never said he'd move back in. He kept his own apartment, his own space, but there was a toothbrush by the sink, his coffee in the cabinet. They laughed more now. They fought sometimes too, but they fought like people trying to understand, not win. Julia told Lydia, "We're not married. Not really." "What are you?" She hesitated. "Two people who wrecked each other and still show up." Lydia tilted her head. "That sounds a lot like love." Final chapter. The choice it came one quiet evening. The house humming with soft jazz, dinner dishes in the sink. Darren looked at her, not with longing, but with clarity. "I want to ask you something." "Okay. Would you ever marry me again?" She blinked, not shocked, not angry, just tired of pretending she didn't already ask herself that same question every day. "I don't know." "That's fair. But if I did," she added, "I wouldn't wear white this time. I'd wear gray or blue." He smiled. Something honest. Something real. Epilogue. Still learning. They never remarried. Not yet. But they traveled. Together. Slept in the same bed more nights than not. Spoke the truth even when it hurt. They were learning that trust isn't something you rebuild. It's something you replant. One season at a time. There was a difference, Darren had learned, between silence and peace. Peace was earned. Silence was just the absence of noise. For months, Darren had confused the two. In the quiet of his apartment, book-lined, sunlit, falsely serene, he told himself healing was happening. That every empty room was a form of progress, but healing wasn't silent. It screamed. It pulled at the edges of his sleep, in dreams where Julia's eyes looked through him like glass, where her voice came not with rage but with disappointment, that quieter, sharper pain. He hadn't cheated on Julia to hurt her. He'd done it because part of him already believed he'd lost her. He just hadn't admitted it aloud. Camille offered no judgment, just validation. She made him feel essential again. Useful, respected, but it had been a transaction, not a connection. He knew that now. He wondered why knowing it didn't make him feel any less ashamed. Chapter 2. The Therapist's Office. "You're still punishing yourself," said Sarah, his therapist. "Shouldn't I be?" Sarah raised a brow. What does punishing yourself accomplish? It keeps me honest. No, Darren. It keeps you stuck. He shifted in his chair. She forgave me too easily. That scares me. Why? Because I don't think I deserve it. Sarah leaned forward. Maybe forgiveness isn't about deserving. Maybe it's about surviving. He didn't have an answer to that, but it haunted him. Chapter 3. Julia's birthday. He baked her a cake. Chocolate. The kind she used to make for her students when she taught second grade. She wasn't expecting anything. That was the agreement. They'd decided not to mark things with expectations. But he brought it anyway. Left it on the porch with a note. I didn't know how to celebrate you last year. I do now. No pressure, no message. Just cake, she texted. Him that night. Julia, you remembered the sea salt on top. That used to be your least favorite part. Darren, some bitterness belongs in sweetness. Learned that from you. She didn't reply, but she sent him a photo the next morning. An empty plate, a fork, a glass of wine beside it, and for the first time in months, Darren smiled without guilt, tagging along. Chapter 4. The Temptation 2. Escape one night in November, Darren received a message from Lena, the therapist he'd briefly dated. I miss our conversations. Want to grab coffee sometime? He stared at it for 15 minutes. Then he did something new. He called Julia. She answered on the second ring. Hey, he said, voice cautious. I just wanted to tell you something before I decided anything. You don't owe me that, No. That's why I'm doing it. He told her about the message. There was a long pause. Then Julia said, Do you want to go? I don't know. Part of me does. Part of me thinks it would be easier. Cleaner. And the other part? Still wants to build something here. With you. Even if it's messier. Another pause. You're allowed to choose peace, Darren, she whispered. Even if it's not with me. But I want to choose truth. And you're the only person who ever demanded that from me. This time she didn't say anything. He wasn't sure if that was silence or peace, but he hung up without replying to Lena. Chapter 5. The Garden in Winter. He started showing up twice a week to help with the garden. At first, they worked in near silence, side by side. Then came the small talk. Then real talk. One afternoon, Julia knelt beside the overgrown rosemary and said, Do you think we ever really knew each other? I think we knew parts, Darren replied. The rest, we pretended. I don't want to pretend anymore. He didn't either. Final chapter. A question with no answer. Snow fell late that year. They watched it from the porch together, wrapped in separate blankets, separate thoughts. Julia turned to him. If I asked you to move back in, would you say yes? Darren looked at her. No, not yet. She didn't look hurt, just thoughtful. Good, she said, because I don't want the version of you that says yes too easily. He smiled. What version do you want? The one who says yes, when he means it. Darren reached for her hand. She let him. They sat in silence, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. Epilogue, truth, season by season. They didn't remarry. They didn't separate. They grew into something unnamed, not healed, but healing, not innocent, but honest, and sometimes on good days that was enough. On bad days they reminded each other, we chose this, not for who we were, but for who we still might become. Together. It was a Wednesday when Julia got the call. Her father had collapsed in his backyard. Stroke, nonverbal, ICU. By the time she reached the hospital, her mother was already pacing, teary and panicked. Julia moved into action. insurance papers, doctors, consent forms, like grief had a checklist. Darren showed up that night uninvited. He didn't say anything. Just sat with her in the waiting room and brought her a sandwich she wouldn't touch. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Chapter 2. The letter. 2 weeks into her father's hospitalization, Julia's mother handed her a sealed envelope. A will, handwritten, old. With it, a faded photograph. Julia froze. It was a picture of her father, with a woman she didn't recognize, holding a baby. On the back, Tessa, 1989, my daughter. I'm sorry. Her father had another child, an affair, a hidden life, one her mother had apparently known about and silently buried. It was one time, her mother said, voice brittle. He came back. I forgave him, but it changed everything. Julia stared at the photo. Her mother added almost gently, some betrayals don't end marriages. They just redraw the lines inside them. Julia said nothing, but that night, she lay awake beside Darren in the guest room of her childhood home, and the silence between them wasn't unfamiliar. It was inherited. Chapter 3. Echoes. The revelation unspooled something in Julia. Not just anger, but recognition. Her father had cheated. Her mother had kept it quiet, buried it. For decades, Julia had always believed she was stronger, that she wouldn't stay after betrayal. But here she was, still with Darren, still choosing him. And now she had to ask herself the same question she'd silently judged her mother for. Was this love or fear of starting over? Chapter 4. Darren's confession late one night, while Julia sat at the dining table flipping through her father's letters, Darren walked in with a half-empty glass of bourbon. I need to tell you something. She looked up. Braced. It's not cheating, he said quickly. Nothing like that. But it's a lie. Or maybe just something I let you believe. He sat down across from her. The bourbon trembled in his hand. You always thought the affair ended when you found out, but it didn't. Not right away. Camille and we tried for a few weeks. It crashed, fast. But I let you think it ended when you confronted me. I didn't correct that. Julia went quiet. Her face didn't change, but something inside her rearranged itself. How long? 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Did you love her? No. I just didn't know how to let go of being needed. She closed her eyes, nodded once, then got up and walked out of the room. Chapter 5. The third option. For days, Julia didn't speak to him. She took care of her father, supported her mother, wrote a letter to Tessa, the half-sister she hadn't met yet. But she didn't speak to Darren. Not until the night before they left for home. They sat in the car outside the hospital. Her father had regained limited speech, enough to whisper her name with clarity, enough to squeeze her hand. I realized something, she said quietly. Darren turned to her, wary. There's this idea that after betrayal you either forgive or you leave, but I think there's a third option. What's that? You stay, but you change. You redraw the lines, not because of punishment, but because something cracked, and now everything fits differently. Darren nodded. So where do we fit now? I don't know yet, she whispered. But I'm done pretending we can go back. Chapter 6. Home again. They returned to their house in silence. He moved back into the guest room, not as exile, but as space. Julia started therapy, on her own. Darren kept going to his. They talked, but not always about the big things. They watered the garden, they paid bills, they argued over dinner, they laughed sometimes, quietly, cautiously. They were, in a way, still married. just not in the way they used to be. Final chapter. The dinner table. Months later, on a soft spring night, they sat across from each other at dinner. Julia looked at him, eyes clearer than they had been in years. "I don't know what we are," she said, "but I don't regret staying. Not yet." Darren nodded. "I don't regret telling the truth, even though it nearly cost me you." They didn't toast, they didn't kiss, they just sat there. Two people who had hurt each other, stayed, broken apart again, and still somehow made room at the table. Whatever came next would be something new, not perfect, but real, and for now, that was enough. Ending, bittersweet, open, human. The cafe was small, tucked off a side street in Asheville, North Carolina. Julia had chosen it because it was neutral, not too quiet, not too intimate. A place where strangers met and decided if they wanted to stay strangers. Tessa arrived 5 minutes early. She looked like someone Julia could have passed in a grocery store and never known. Until she smiled. It was their father's smile. Crooked on the left, warm but reserved, like it had to be earned. "Julia?" she asked. Julia nodded, rising. They shook hands like people about to start something delicate. Neither mentioned their father's name for 10 minutes. They talked. About the weather, the almond croissants, the fact that Tessa had a son in 2nd grade who hated reading unless dragons were involved. But finally, the conversation curved toward the truth. "My mom never told me," Tessa said. "She always said he was someone who walked away before he had a name." Julia folded her hands. "He didn't walk. He hid." Tessa nodded, the corner of her mouth tightening. "I'm still not sure why I came. Part of me didn't want to." "No, I understand," Julia said. "I spent my whole life thinking I had the full picture. And?" "I didn't," Julia said quietly. "Turns out we both got fragments of a man." Later that evening, back at the Airbnb, Julia opened her laptop and started writing again. Not to Tessa this time, to Darren. They had decided not to define their relationship. Not yet. They still lived in the same house, still shared breakfast most mornings. But their lives were gently diverging like rivers splitting around a rock, still connected, still possible. Email to Darren's subject. "Fragments, I met her today. She's kind, quiet, a little cautious, like me. She asked me if I thought our father loved us both." I didn't know what to say. But then I realized, I don't know if love is about constancy anymore, or perfection. Maybe it's about presence, and what we do when we're finally honest. I told her I'm still learning to love someone after betrayal, that some days it's easier than others. But it made me think of you. We've been through fire, Darren. And sometimes I look at you and still feel burned, but other times, I see the man who stayed, who told the truth even when it hurt. So thank you for showing up, for not running. We're still fragments. But maybe that's all anyone is. Maybe that's enough. J. Final image. Darren reads the email at midnight. He doesn't respond right away. He walks to the kitchen, pours a glass of water, and stares out into the backyard where the porch light flickers, just like the night she first asked him to move back in. There's no music. No dramatic moment, just a soft exhale. He walks back to his desk, opens a new draft, and types, "Julia, let's rebuild something, even if it's not the same shape as before." He doesn't hit send, not yet, but he saves it, and that, for now, is a beginning. Darren sat at the old mahogany desk in his study, the one Julia had threatened to replace a dozen times. The hinges creaked, the drawers stuck, but he kept it. Not out of nostalgia, but because it was flawed and functional. Like him. The glow from the monitor cast pale light over the room. Julia's email still sat open. He reread it. Twice. Maybe more. Every word pressed into him like a fingerprint. Soft, specific, unavoidable. We're still fragments, but maybe that's all anyone is. He leaned back in the chair, stared at the ceiling. It was strange. He had once feared losing her more than anything. And yet what haunted him now wasn't losing her. It was the possibility that he never truly had her to begin with. Not completely, not the way he should have. He thought about Camille sometimes. Not sexually, not even romantically, but abstractly, like the echo of a mistake in a hallway you haven't walked in years. He didn't love her. He never had. What he had loved was the version of himself she reflected back. Needed, respected, uncomplicated. But it had been hollow, and he'd known it, even while he stayed, even while he lied. He had broken something sacred in Julia, not just trust, but that unspoken certainty that she was enough, that she was home. The guilt had matured into something quieter now, not shame, but a kind of grief. A mourning for the version of their life that would never come back. Later, that night, he stepped into the backyard. The porch light flickered again. He should have fixed it months ago. Instead, he stood in the glow of its inconsistency and looked up at the dark sky. The moon was a sliver, barely there, but present, like Julia's trust. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the ring he still wore on a chain. Not around his finger anymore. Not since the day she'd asked for space. But he hadn't removed it completely. That felt important. He thumbed the smooth band and whispered aloud, to no one in particular. I stayed. I'm still staying, but I don't know if I'm allowed to hope. A few days later, a choice, he was at the hardware store when Julia texted him. Dinner tonight? Just us. Nothing serious. I'll cook. He stared at the screen, smiled. Typed back. I'll bring wine. No expectations. For once, the word us didn't feel like a landmine. It felt like a doorway. Closing. Image Darren pulls into the driveway at dusk. Julia's silhouette moves past the window. There's music playing, something old and low, like jazz that forgot how to be upbeat. He steps inside. The house doesn't feel like it used to, but it doesn't feel empty either. He sets the wine on. The table looks at her and says, Smells good. She smiles. It's burnt. They both laugh, and somewhere in the quiet, in the ordinary, something forgives itself. Not completely, but enough. Tessa sat on the porch swing of her duplex, watching her son, Max, try to coax a caterpillar onto a stick. The boy hummed to himself, crouched low, focused, like the rest of the world didn't exist. Tessa envied him. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from Julia. Thinking of you today. No pressure, just, I'm here. Tessa read it 3 times before locking her screen and setting the phone face down. She appreciated the gesture, but she didn't know how to respond, because the truth was, she didn't know what she wanted from Julia. She had come to that cafe out of curiosity, maybe even desperation. But what she'd left with wasn't closure. It was a door she didn't know how to walk through. A sister, a bloodline, a history rewritten in a single afternoon. Later, that evening, after Max was asleep and the house had gone still, Tessa pulled a box from the hall closet. Inside were years of forgotten scraps, report cards, photos, birthday cards from her mother. She found a faded envelope addressed in looping, unsure handwriting. To my daughter. Maybe someday. Her throat tightened. She remembered this. Her mother had found it in an old coat pocket the year before she died. She'd said nothing about it at the time. Just folded it back up and buried it in the box. Tessa had been too young to ask the right questions then. Now she was old enough to ache with answers. The letter. Tessa. I don't know if I have the right to write this. I'm not sure I ever will. But I want you to know I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I didn't know how to love without breaking things. There is someone else. A daughter I failed before I even knew how to be a father. I've hurt too many people. And maybe I don't deserve the chance to make anything right. But you deserve truth. You deserve more than my absence. I'm sorry. For everything I didn't give you, and for all the silence I left behind. She folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Next morning, a message. Tessa opened her phone, stared at Julia's last text, and finally typed, "He never came back." Not even once. But I think he wanted to. I found a letter. I'm not ready to talk about it yet. But I don't want this to disappear either. You asked me if I'd meet your son someday. Maybe not today, but one day. Let's just not be strangers. She hit send, then stepped out into the yard with Max, where the caterpillar had begun weaving a cocoon on the side of the porch railing. Life-changing shape in silence. Closing image, Tessa watches the light spill across the lawn. Her mother is gone, her father a shadow. But somewhere in North Carolina, there's a woman who looks just a little like her, who laughs in the same rhythm, who carries the same fractured legacy in her chest. They don't have to fix everything. They just have to begin. Julia poured 2 mugs of coffee and hesitated. She still didn't know if Darren would want cream today. Some mornings he did. Others he drank it black, like he needed the bitterness to wake him up. She left it black. Let him choose. When she stepped into the living room, he was already dressed. Not for court. He'd taken a leave of absence. But he still wore button-downs like armor, sleeves rolled to the forearms, a pen always tucked behind one ear. He took the coffee. Nodded. Thanks. That was their rhythm now. Careful gratitude. Neutral ground. No assumptions. Sometimes she missed the ease of old love, the shorthand, the finishing of sentences. But sometimes, this new slowness felt honest. Hard-won. A little raw, but real. Later, couples therapy. They sat in the office of Dr. Lena Marks, a woman with gray curls, piercing eyes, and an eerie ability to dismantle silence with a glance. "So," Lena said, "you've been under the same roof for 6 months. No new crises. What's that been like?" Darren spoke first, which was unusual. "It's quiet. Some days it feels safe. Others it feels like we're just coexisting." Julia nodded. "I think we're both scared to ruin the progress. Like if we say the wrong thing, we're back at 0. Lena tilted her head. "Do you trust him now, Julia?" Silence. Then, "Some days, I trust his intentions. I'm not sure I trust his judgment. And Darren, do you feel forgiven?" He stared at his hands. "I don't think I do, not yet, but I don't think I've forgiven myself either." That hung in the room, heavy, but not hopeless. That night, a simple act. They were brushing their teeth, side by side, like strangers, playing a couple on TV. Julia spit, rinsed, turned to leave, and paused. Darren was watching her in the mirror, not longing, not lust. Just presence. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I like this version of us." She blinked. "Even like this?" He gave a half smile. "Especially like this. It feels earned." That night they shared a bed. They hadn't in weeks. No sex, just proximity. She felt his hand brush hers beneath the sheets and didn't pull away. It wasn't romance. It was a treaty. 3 weeks later, the party. Their friend Dana was turning 40, and the house was full of old music, catered food, and too many people, pretending not to be tired. Julia stood by the window sipping a drink when a woman she barely knew approached her. "You're Darren's wife, right?" "Still?" Julia wondered. "Am I?" "I am," she said aloud. "I just wanted to say, he talks about you a lot. He always says you're the smartest person he knows." Julia's throat caught. Later that night, she repeated the story to him in the car. Just to see his reaction, he laughed, dry. "Guess I do talk about you too much." "No," she said. "You don't. Not to me." That wasn't a wound. It was an invitation. Closing. Image Julia stands in the garden the next morning, pulling weeds around the rosemary bush that somehow survived winter. Darren joins her, no words exchanged. Just gloves, soil, breath. There is still so much unsaid, but she doesn't flinch when he leans in to kiss her temple. They are still rebuilding, and that for now is enough. Darren sat at his desk, papers scattered in front of him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking at him as though mocking his inability to focus. He had always been good at his job, too good, if he was honest. But now, every case felt like it had a hollow ring to it. It was all transactional, all business. He could pull off the victories, make the deals, win the cases, but none of it felt real anymore. His phone buzzed, another text from Julia. "How's your day?" He stared at it. She had been checking in more often recently, a careful reminder that they were still working their way through the mess they'd made together. He appreciated it. But sometimes, the reminders felt more like fragile strings that could snap at any moment. Long day. Not much progress on the McAllister case. "But I'll be home soon." "How's Max?" he typed back, trying to keep things light. He'd been staying out of the office later, making an effort to be more present at home, to make up for the years he'd spent distracted by work and his own insecurities. Julia's support had kept him grounded, but there was a pressure building inside him, an urge to prove himself to her, to rebuild the trust, to make up for the years he'd lost. But the darkness still lingered, a shadow in the corners of his thoughts. It had been 4 months since Camille's offer. 4 months since he'd kissed her, since the betrayal had almost been a reality. He shook his head, rubbing his temples. No, that was over. He had chosen, and he had chosen Julia. Still, there was something about Camille's message, her insinuation that she understood him, that she knew him better than anyone, that nagged at him. That afternoon, a distant phone call Darren's. Office phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. He recognized the number immediately. It was a colleague, but it was also someone who had more than just professional ties to him, Camille. He stared at the phone for a moment before answering. "Darren." Her voice slid through the receiver, warm and familiar like a whisper of smoke. "How've you been?" His stomach twisted, a mixture of guilt and temptation. "I'm good. Busy." "You?" "Busy, but I've been thinking about our conversation, about what could have been." He closed his eyes for a second. The temptation was there, sharp and real. A moment of weakness, a crack in the armor he'd carefully built. He'd resisted her before. He couldn't afford to slip again. "I told you I'm with Julia now, Camille," Darren said, the words coming out more firmly than he felt. "I can't—" "I know," she interrupted, her voice light, but not quite innocent. "But don't. You miss it, Darren? The excitement? The way things were when we didn't have to worry about anyone else's feelings? No boundaries, no guilt?" He swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. The echo of their time together, the passion, the thrill, called to him. But it was a call that led down a dangerous path. "I miss us, but I'm not going back to that," Darren said, his voice low but steady. "I can't." "Don't be so sure," Camille said softly. "You deserve more than the quiet life you're settling for. You deserve excitement, passion. Don't you remember what that felt like?" The line went dead silent for a moment. He felt the weight of her words, the flickering temptation to undo everything he'd fought for. "I'm with Julia now," he said again, more firmly. "Goodbye, Camille." He hung up before she could respond, his fingers trembling slightly as he placed the phone back on the receiver. That evening, dinner at home. When Darren got home, Julia was already in the kitchen, moving through the motions of dinner, quiet domestic tasks that had once felt mundane but now felt like a lifeline. She looked up when he entered, her expression softening when she saw him. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice steady but searching, as though she, too, could feel the weight of the unspoken between them. "Busy," he replied, a little too quickly as he moved to pour himself a glass of wine. "But I'm here now." He caught a glimpse of her eyes, those familiar green eyes that he'd almost lost. He could tell she was waiting for more, waiting for the truth. But he didn't know how to say it. He couldn't tell her about Camille, about the call, about how close he had come to breaking everything. Not yet. They sat down to dinner, the conversation light, the atmosphere carefully managed. But Darren could feel the distance between them, not physical, but emotional. He could hear the ghost of Camille's words echoing in his mind. "You deserve excitement." Later, that night, the quiet Ward Darren lay awake in bed long after Julia had fallen asleep, the silence pressing down on him. He could hear her soft breathing, the steady rise and fall of her chest. He reached for her hand just to feel the warmth of her skin against his. But it wasn't enough. The temptation lingered, a constant hum in the back of his mind. He loved Julia. He wanted to be with her. But part of him, the part that had been buried for so long, still craved the thrill, the escape. He had made a choice, but sometimes the choice didn't feel like his own. It felt like a cage. He squeezed her, hand tighter, trying to hold on to something real. But what if he was wrong? What if settling for peace meant losing everything? Closing image. The next morning, Julia made breakfast, humming softly to herself. Darren stood in the doorway watching her. She was the same woman he had fallen in love with, the same woman who had fought for their marriage, who had stood by him through the worst. But somehow, she was different now, too. They were both different, and the question lingered in the air between them. Would they ever be able to truly forgive each other? Or was the past always going to hang over them like a storm cloud waiting to break? He didn't have the answers, yet. But as he kissed her goodbye before heading out for work, he wondered if he could find them one day. Julia sat in the living room, flipping through a magazine she had already read twice. The hum of the dishwasher in the background was oddly soothing, a rhythm she had learned to lean on in the quiet after dinner. But tonight, the silence between her and Darren felt different. It wasn't the comfortable kind of quiet they had shared before, the kind that allowed them to breathe without needing to fill the space with words. No, this felt like a distant, unseen wall. Darren had been withdrawn lately, not distant in the way that he had been in the past, when he was always working, always lost in the tangled world of his cases, but more like a man who was fighting something inside himself. The internal battle she could never quite reach. She had noticed the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore, how his hand lingered for just a moment too long on his phone before he put it down. He said he was busy. She believed him. But part of her wondered if there was something else he wasn't telling her. The days stretched on like this, slow, careful. He would kiss her goodbye in the mornings, but the kiss was almost an afterthought. At night they'd talk about trivial things, making small talk while the world swirled around them. They hadn't made love in weeks. It wasn't just the physical distance. It was the emotional gap that had opened up between them, the conversation. She dreaded that evening they sat down for dinner. The same quiet routine, the same small smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Julia placed her fork down, her heart heavy with the words she had been trying to ignore. "Do you love me the way you used to?" It was the question she was too afraid to ask. Instead, She chose a safer route. "Darren," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "What's been going on with you lately?" He looked up from his plate, his eyes guarded. He had been waiting for this, she could tell. There was a brief pause before he answered. "I've just been thinking a lot about everything." His gaze shifted away from her, focusing on the rim of his glass. "It's hard, to move forward after everything that happened, to rebuild trust when you know you've broken it." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. "I've broken it." He didn't just say we, he said I. She had expected him to deflect, to say something about them being in this together, but his guilt was consuming him. It always had been. "I understand," she said, though the words felt hollow, coming out of her mouth. Do I understand? Or am I just lying to myself? The unspoken thing later that night, as they sat on the couch, the television flickering between channels neither of them was paying attention to, Julia noticed Darren's phone buzzing on the table. A text message from someone. Her stomach clenched, as she recognized the name, Camille. Julia had tried to suppress the suspicion that had been gnawing at her for weeks, the quiet unease that had settled deep in her bones. It wasn't just the missed calls or the late nights at the office. It was the way Darren had become so guarded around his phone, his sudden, inexplicable defensiveness. There was a tension that hadn't been there before. She didn't reach for it. She wouldn't. But the temptation was unbearable. Her mind raced with the possibilities. What if Camille hadn't let go of him? What if Darren had been lying to her all this time, hiding something deeper than just a few missed moments of trust? What if he still hadn't truly let go of the affair? But then, as quickly as the thought arrived, it was gone. She had to trust him, didn't she? He said he wanted to rebuild with her. He promised he was done with Camille. "Darren," she said, testing the waters, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is there something you're not telling me?" He glanced at her, his eyes flitting back to the screen for a moment before meeting hers. There was hesitation, a flicker of something that looked too much like guilt. "I haven't been perfect, Julia," he said, his voice low. "But I'm here, with you. That's all that matters, right?" But it didn't feel like enough. The words didn't land. They didn't feel like the reassurance she needed. She wanted him to fight for them, to prove that he had let go of the past and that he wasn't still holding on to secrets. She let out a breath, then turned her gaze back. To the screen, her thoughts scattered. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm the one who can't move on. Maybe I'm still holding on to the hurt more than I'm willing to admit. The temptation to leave. A few days later, Julia stood at the door to their bedroom, staring at the suitcase lying open on the bed. Her heart was racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had come close to packing before, had almost walked away more times than she could count. The temptation to leave, to escape from the slow erosion of their relationship, felt like a relief in some ways. She knew she couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't live in the gray area where everything felt halfway. It was a state of limbo she couldn't stand. She glanced over at Darren, who was standing by the window, staring into the dark. She wondered what he was thinking. Is he thinking about Camille? About the affair? Or was he just thinking about how they could move forward? She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers. She wanted to tear down every wall he had built, to make him see her pain, to make him see how deeply he had scarred her. But instead, she turned toward the suitcase, closed it slowly, and sat on the bed. She didn't know if she was ready to walk away, not yet. But she also didn't know if she was ready to stay. Closing image, as the weeks passed, the space between them continued to grow. Quiet, invisible, but undeniable. Julia and Darren both knew that the road they were walking was precarious, filled with obstacles they could never have foreseen. It was a path lined with mistakes, regret, and the persistent hope of reconciliation. But the question remained, could they ever truly heal? As Julia lay awake, staring at the ceiling, she thought about the life she had built with Darren. The love, the betrayal, the second chances. She didn't have the answers yet, and maybe she never would. But she knew this. Whatever happened, she had to find a way to choose herself again. Darren stood by the window, staring into the darkened backyard, watching the faint outline of the trees sway in the wind. His mind was restless, caught between what he had promised and what he feared was inevitable. He could feel the tension, thick and suffocating, closing in around him. It wasn't just the weight of his past mistakes that haunted him. It was the suffocating reality of his marriage. The promises he had made, the things he had said to Julia, and the things he had never been able to truly confess. "I'm here with you," he had told her, but was he really? In his heart, he wasn't sure. The weight of guilt had become a constant companion. He couldn't escape it. It followed him everywhere. Every time he looked at Julia, every time he kissed her, every time they shared a moment, the weight of what he had done pressed down harder. Camille. The affair. It had been months since it ended, but Darren knew the damage it had done. He knew that no amount of apologies or sweet words could erase the scars he had left on their relationship. But what gnawed at him the most wasn't the affair itself. It was the way he had handled the aftermath. Julia deserved better. She deserved more than the half-hearted attempts at making things right. He had told her he wanted to rebuild, but had he truly done everything he could to make amends? Or had he been running from the harder truths, burying the guilt deeper every day until it became unbearable? The call he shouldn't have answered. That night, Darren's phone buzzed again. It was the same name, Camille. He stared at it for a long time, his thumb hovering over the screen before he finally picked it up. "Darren," Camille's voice was soft, almost coaxing. "I've been thinking about you. About us." His pulse quickened. There was a pang in his chest, an old, familiar ache that he had buried when he chose Julia over the affair. He had told Camille he was done with her. He had promised that he was moving forward, but the call, the sound of her voice, brought it all flooding back. The secrecy, the passion, the moments of tenderness they had shared when everything with Julia felt too fragile. "I can't do this anymore, Camille," Darren said, his voice betraying him. "I've made my choice. I'm with Julia now, you know that." But Camille wasn't done. "But Darren, I don't think you understand. I'm not asking for us to go back to what we were. I'm just saying, maybe there's something still there. Something you've been ignoring." He rubbed his forehead, the weight of her words sinking in. Julia, his wife, the woman he had promised to rebuild his life with, the woman who had been fighting so hard to trust him again. And here he was, being pulled into a conversation he had no business having. "I can't do this to her again. I won't," he said, his voice firm now. But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his chest. Was it possible that what he felt for Camille wasn't completely gone? Or was it just the ghosts of the past clinging to him, a constant reminder of the man he used to be, the conversation he needed to have? Later that night, as Julia curled up on the couch, lost in a book, Darren sat down beside her, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He had to tell her. He had to come clean about the call, about the temptation he had almost succumbed to. It was the only way forward. There couldn't be any more secrets between them. "Julia," he began, his voice low, uncertain. "There's something I need to tell you." She looked up from her book, her eyes weary, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. It had been like this for weeks. Every conversation felt like a step towards something they both weren't sure would ever be repaired. She set the book down, her gaze never leaving him. "What is it, Darren?" she asked, her tone flat but steady. I spoke to Camille today." "I shouldn't have," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "She called me and I answered. I know I shouldn't have. I don't know. It brought up old things I've been trying to bury." Julia's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. She said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch between them. She wasn't surprised, not really. She had known something wasn't right. Her gut had told her he was still holding on to something, still thinking about her. She didn't even know why it hurt so much, but it did. "I'm not proud of it," Darren continued, his voice cracking. "I don't want to hurt you, Julia. I swear I don't. But I need to be honest with you. I don't want any more secrets. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with me, why I can't stop looking backward." Julia swallowed, her throat dry. The words she had been avoiding were suddenly here, staring her in the face. Her mind raced, but she didn't know what to say. What was there left to say? "I wish I could say something that would make this all make sense," Darren said, reaching for her hand, his touch tentative. "But the truth is, I'm scared, Julia. I'm scared that I can't fix this, that I can't be who you need me to be anymore. And I'm scared that I'll lose you for good." The moment of truth. Julia stared at their hands, the space between them filled with years of shared memories, of love and betrayal, of promises and broken pieces. She had to make a choice. She had to decide what kind of future she wanted, one where she stayed in this marriage, in this limbo, or one where she walked away and started over. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of things left undone. And for a moment, Julia realized something. Maybe this was the hardest part. Not the betrayal, not the affair, but the question of whether they could still love each other after everything they had been through. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Darren," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you again." Her words hit him like a wave. He hadn't expected her to say that, not after everything they had tried. But there it was. The truth. He had broken her. He had destroyed the trust they had built, and now it was too late to fix it. The walls he had built between them were too high. He squeezed her hand, knowing that it might not be enough. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, the rawness of his regret spilling over. "But if you need to go, I'll understand. I just hope we can find a way back. I hope I can prove to you that I'm still the man you married. But if not, I'll let you go." End of chapter. Julia sat in silence, unsure of what her heart truly wanted. What she wanted now. There was no easy answer, no sudden fix. Just a fractured trust and the hope that perhaps love might be enough to rebuild what had been shattered. Would it ever be enough?